way did the minimum wage laws, none of which were even passed in this country until 1912, precede, let alone cause, the improvements that the average 19th century American saw to his standard of living. In no way did the Occupational Safety and Health Administration or any other mandated minimum safety standards of the 20th century retroactively change the economic outlook of people who existed 100 years prior to their implementation. As a matter of fact, there's no clear evidence that OSHA has reduced workplace accidents at all. Some economists even argue that it actually increases them. Anyway, for the most part, these laws were adopted once the United States had already reached a level of development that had mostly eliminated the conditions the laws made illegal. The US did not pass meaningful legislation against child labor until 1938, when its per capita income was already more than $10,200 in 2010 dollars. In his book, Government and the American Economy, economist Price Fishback writes, quote, "Child labor laws appear to exemplify existing social trends coinciding with or preceding legislation. Between 1880 and 1920, the labor market participation rates of children fell nearly sixfold, while a well-organized social movement pressured state legislatures to enact limits on child employment. Studies of this period suggest that relatively little of the decline in child participation rates can be attributed to the introduction of child labor legislations. As their demand for child labor fell, the employers who had already eliminated it, reduced their opposition to child labor laws. In fact, they may have even actively supported the legislation to force recalcitrant employers to follow in their footsteps. Fishback argues that most safety regulations appear to have codified existing practices in the relevant industry. Indeed, when safety laws were passed that exceeded the industry standards, they often weren't enforced anyway, such as was the case with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911. In their study of labor legislation in America, economists Joshua Hall and Peter Leeson show that by the time collective bargaining rights, child labor laws, minimum wage legislation, and occupational health and safety standards were adopted, the US was already significantly beyond the per capita income levels of present-day sweatshop countries. To implement similar standards in those countries today would lead to the outcomes I discussed just a moment ago. So what can we do? Well, virtually every wealthy country in the world today had sweatshops at one point in their past. Indeed, up to this point in history, sweatshops have been an important stage in the process of economic development. As economist Jeffrey Sachs puts it, sweatshops are the first rung on the ladder out of extreme poverty. And as discussed earlier, the proximate causes of high productivity are capital accumulation, skills, and technology. Sweatshops play a role in increasing all three. So if you want to further nurture the development of those three items, we can support policies that engender the rule of law, private property, the sanctity of contracts, and access to markets for those in developing economies. Sadly, there's no silver bullet here. However, there is, I think, reason for optimism. When we look back at the very early stages of modern economic growth, we see that it was a long, arduous process. It began in the United Kingdom, particularly in England, and soon after it spread to the United States. What took a couple of hundred years to happen in England took only 100 years in America. What took 100 years in America took only 40 years in Japan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And what took 40 years in those countries took only 30 in China. Again, back to Benjamin Powell. The East Asian success stories had a distinct advantage over Great Britain when they developed. Their capital formation could happen much faster because they could draw on saving from wealthy countries in addition to their own savings. When foreign firms made investments in those countries, they created many of the buildings and machines that the citizens of Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and South Korea could work with. The same is true in poor countries today. When multinational companies open up sweatshops in third world countries, they are using the savings in first world countries to create capital in third world countries. Over time, the accumulation of capital in these countries leads to increased productivity and higher standards of living. Our own process of growth and development in America took a great amount of time. It will not take anywhere near as long for those countries who are just starting today, so long as they nurture conditions whereby specialization and exchange, capital accumulation, and technological innovation are able to flourish. Moreover, I hope that as we think about this issue, we realize that good intentions do not necessarily make good policy. There are trade-offs, costs, and benefits to every action, and we owe it not merely to ourselves, but to others to explore and examine them as best we can. Sadly, policies which well-intentioned people support, and which often look very good on paper, sometimes actually end up having unintended consequences that cut against the intentions of the people whom we are trying, or against the interests of the people we're trying to help. I'd like to close with a quotation from an economist I mentioned earlier. Paul Krugman is perhaps one of the 2 or 3 most famous economists in the world currently. He recently won a Nobel Memorial Prize in economics for his work in international trade, and he writes a very popular op-ed column and blog for the New York Times. Krugman writes, "The advantages of established first world industries are still formidable. The only reason developing countries have been able to compete with those industries is their ability to offer employers cheap labor. Deny them that ability, and you might well deny them the prospect of continuing industrial growth, even reverse the growth that has been achieved. And since export-oriented growth, for all of its injustice, has been a huge boon for the workers in those nations, anything that curtails that growth is very much against their interests. A policy of good jobs in principle, but no jobs in practice, might assuage our consciences, but it is no favor to the alleged beneficiaries. You may say that the wretched of the earth should not be forced to serve as hewers of wood, drawers of water, and sewers of sneakers for the affluent. But what's the alternative? Should they be helped with foreign aid? Maybe, although the historical record of regions like southern Italy suggests that such aid has a tendency to promote perpetual dependence. Anyway, there isn't the slightest prospect of significant aid materializing. Should their own governments provide more social justice? Of course, but they won't, or at least not because we tell them to. And as long as you have no realistic alternative to industrialization based on low wages, to oppose it means that you are willing to deny desperately poor people the best chance they have of progress for the sake of what amounts to an aesthetic standard. That is, the fact that you don't like the idea of workers being paid a pittance to supply rich Westerners with fashion items. When the hopes of hundreds of millions are at stake, thinking things through is not just good intellectual practice, it is a moral duty." Close quote. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt. We'll defer to the students first. I'm sure there's a lot of questions. I see some of my students mixed in with some of Matt's students. Anthony was writing down some things for us to.
Let's get your response.
Say what?
It's a joke. It could be Anthony.